in very close proximity where Jesus was teaching at the synagogue, and he made the statement, and he was sharing with those who were listening, so important. He says, unless you eat my bread, my body, my flesh, and drink my blood, you have no part in the resurrection. When God raises those from the dead in the last days, you'll have no part in that if you do not eat my flesh and drink my blood, which was a revolutionary concept to them from the standpoint of an individual pointing to himself, one that they knew from the village, from Nazareth. They said, isn't this Joseph's son? It was revolutionary from that perspective, but I want to share with you, not that the people could have necessarily known all the details, because they didn't know what Jesus was about to do. But when we can look at it in retrospect and we look back, in our minds we tie it to communion.
Right.
And we tie it to what Jesus said to his disciples at the Last Supper, just hours before he's going to go to the cross of Calvary. And what did Jesus say to his disciples?
Do this in remembrance of
Take,
me.
eat, this is my
Body
which is broken for
you.
And then he says, I want you to drink this cup in memory. This is, and what does he say? This is the New Testament, in our Bibles is what it says, in my blood. Testament is covenant.
Covenant.
Testament and covenant, interchangeable words. And it's sad that a lot of our Bibles today say testament, because people gloss over it and they say, oh yeah, I know the New Testament. And you think it's the second half of your Bible. But folks, there's so much more invested in this, and we're going to touch on this, Lord willing, when we get to Jerusalem and when we're at the Garden Tomb. But it's important because Jesus it shares this concept here because he knows what he's going to be doing and the purpose for which he came in the first place. Listen, when Jesus says this is the New Testament or New Covenant in my blood, take, drink ye all of it. He's saying that it's a memorial, but listen very carefully. He is establishing a new covenant. A new covenant. Listen, a covenant was a solemn oath. When God made covenants, there was a series of them through the Bible. When God made a covenant, it was a solemn oath that he made, and he made several crucial covenants through history. Very briefly, when God made a covenant with Abraham, what did he do with the covenant he made with Abraham? He said, Abraham, take an animal. I want you to kill it. I want you to divide these animals on the sides of a path. God puts Abraham into a trance or a deep sleep, and God himself unilaterally, usually covenants were made between two individuals. In this case, with the Abrahamic covenant, God says, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to give you a land. And God unilaterally, one, has Abraham sever the parts of the animal, a very bloody mess. But God puts Abraham into a sleep, and God alone walks through. And here's the point. When God made a covenant with Abraham, it was cut in blood. Flash forward later to when God is using Moses at Mount Sinai to give his law. Another covenant that God is making with his people. But this covenant was bilateral between God and the people of Israel. So when Moses is told by God, tell the people, ask them, if you do these things, then I will bless you. Do you agree to do these things so that I, as God, can bring blessing to you and your flocks and your herds and your cities? If you do keep these laws, then I will bless you. A covenant was cut. Moses killed an animal, and the Bible tells us that he sprinkled the blood on the people who had agreed to keep their end of the deal, to keep their covenant. But that covenant, which was made by God with the people, the children of Israel, they had just come out of Egypt. They were in Egypt for over 400 years. They were a motley crew of people. They were not uneducated. They had slime under their fingernails. God didn't forget his promise to Abraham, his covenant promise. And now 400 and some years later, he has Moses. And listen, the children of Israel, they needed laws. They needed laws. They were about to go into a new land. They were going in to establish a new land. They needed to have laws, more than just the 10 Commandments, probably 613 or so of them. Civil laws, ceremonial laws, religious laws. They needed that. Those laws, the Mosaic Covenant, was not a way to life. It was supposed to be a way of life to keep those laws that God gave. It was never, listen, Abraham believed God, faith, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. Not keeping the law. There was no law at that point. The law came later, but it was temporary and stopgap. It was for people who were going into a new nation. Now listen, Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 31, he says, "The time is coming, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the one I made with them in the wilderness coming out of Egypt, which covenant they broke." The point is, the Mosaic law was good, but it was unkeepable. It was not possible to keep. And therefore, even in the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah says, "Thus saith the Lord, I will make the days come, I will make a new covenant." So flash forward to Jesus here in Capernaum. And Jesus is saying, you have to eat my flesh, the bread, the communion. You have to drink my blood. Why? Because in the upper room, a short time from here in Capernaum, he's going to go to the cross of Calvary, and he's in the upper room with his disciples just hours before, and he's establishing, he says, what I'm going to do the next day when I go to the cross, I'm establishing that new covenant. And were covenants made, how were they made? In blood. So the point that Jesus is making here in the synagogue to the disciples is, I'm about to establish a new covenant, not like the covenant that Moses made and God made with you when you came out of Egypt, which you broke, which is not a way to life, only a way of life. I am the one from heaven, sent from God, who will be the one to make a new covenant, cut in my blood. And that is why what Jesus is saying to them is, unless you embrace and believe in the fact that I am come to die for the sins of humanity, you will not partake in the resurrection when my Father comes, sends me back to earth. And the point is, he's making a new covenant. That's why here in the synagogue, Jesus is referring to eating his flesh and drinking his blood. It's a new covenant that is coming when he dies on the cross for the sin of the world. And it's not just in Jeremiah 31, it's also in Hebrews chapter 8. The writer to the book of Hebrews, listen, the whole point of the book of Hebrews, the whole point is that the Jews were struggling after the death of Jesus Christ and his resurrection. They were struggling to go back to the old covenant, to go back to the Mosaic covenant, which was temporary. And even in the Old Testament writer Jeremiah knew that it was temporary, and even said that there's a new covenant coming, cut in blood, and Jesus Christ is the one who instituted it. That's why this is so significant here at Capernaum in terms of what Jesus said at the synagogue. Okay.
And I think a lot of Christians miss